Talking Trees with Lily and Jad. Welcome to this special recap episode of Talking Trees. In this episode, we'll revisit some of the most insightful discussions on tree care and management. We begin with an exploration of the lifelong approach to tree care, then delve into the forces and movements involved in arborist climbing. Next, we discuss the importance of protecting trees during construction activities and review Santa Moore's 10-20-30 rule for tree diversification. We'll also look at effective management strategies for mistletoe and finish with a summary of recent studies on horse chestnut diseases. Join us as we recap these essential topics and highlight their impact on sustainable tree care and urban forestry.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This week we're going, deep into the world of arboriculture. Specifically for you, our professional arborist listeners. We're breaking down last week's Talking Trees episodes, giving you the need-to-know info without having to climb through hours of content.
Yeah, it was a pretty packed week.
It sounds like it. So where did Talking Trees kick things off?
Well, Monday's episode started with a new book, Lifespan Approach to Tree Care. It's a compilation of insights from, mostly European arborists about caring for trees throughout their entire life cycle. From saplings to those grand old trees.
And not just keeping them alive, but really helping them thrive.
Mm-hmm.
Making sure they're resilient and healthy for as long as possible. So what were some of the key takeaways for our listeners who are, actually out there caring for these trees day in and day out?
One of the big things the book emphasizes is understanding how tree biology changes as a tree ages and how that should really impact our care strategies. A young tree is going to have different needs and vulnerabilities than a mature tree.
So give us an example of how that might play out in practice.
Well, they talked a lot about the caudate principle. That's compartmentalization of decay in trees. It basically means understanding how trees have these incredible internal defense mechanisms to kind of isolate and contain decay. And the book really dives deep into how that process actually changes as a tree ages and how different species, they have different caudate strategies.
Okay, so how does that actually affect how we approach something like pruning?
So think about pruning a mature oak that's got a large cavity versus a young sapling with a small wound. With that big oak, you're going to prioritize supporting its existing defenses, minimizing the disruption to that compartmentalization zone. But with a sapling, you might focus more on promoting rapid wound closure.
So it's about tailoring your approach to the tree's age, the species, and the specific situation, right?
Exactly. And they also talk about the importance of sustainable care for those magnificent mature trees, recognizing their ecological value, their contribution to biodiversity. They're not just individual trees. They're key parts of this larger ecosystem.
Right. Supporting everything from the insects that live in their bark to the birds that nest in their branches.
And another cool thing about this book, it was actually a result of international collaboration. So, arborists from all over the world coming together to share their knowledge and experiences. It really shows that this passion for caring for trees, it's a global thing.
It is. Okay, so moving on from Tuesday's episode of Talking Trees looked at tree climbing safety.
Right, something I'm sure every arborist thinks about every time they gear up. They featured a study that actually measured the forces at play during different climbing activities. So things like, the force on anchor points and the acceleration of branches during typical movements.
That's interesting. So what did they learn from all that?
Well, one surprising finding was that the forces involved in just climbing upwards were actually lower than those experienced during ascents or sudden stops while you're descending, and then, of course, simulated falls.
That is surprising. I think most people, myself included, would assume that the biggest stress on a branch is when you're, pulling yourself upward.
Yeah, but it really highlights how much those sudden movements and those unexpected jolts, how much they can impact both the tree and the climber. It really underscores the importance of proper technique and smooth transitions.
Yeah, absolutely. So what else did this study reveal? Anything that would be particularly interesting to our listeners?
Well, they found that the shape and structure of the branch and anchor points, so things like branch diameter and angle, can significantly affect the forces involved.
Okay, so that's really important for arborists to consider when they're making decisions about where to anchor in.
Absolutely. It highlights how much careful observation and really, understanding tree biomechanics play into every climb.
It's not just about strength and agility. It's about working with the tree, understanding its limits.
Exactly.
Okay, so Wednesday's episode shifted gears a bit and focused on, a topic that's very relevant to urban forestry, protecting trees during construction.
They actually covered it from several different angles, which was interesting.
Oh, like what?
Well, they started by discussing a study from a few years ago, 2021, by Pike and some colleagues. It looked at how effective tree protection ordinances actually are in practice. So they focused on Highland Park, Illinois, and they analyzed tree health before and after construction to see if there were any connections with things like proximity to paved surfaces or the level of soil compaction.
So they weren't just looking at the rules on paper, but how those rules actually translated into tree survival. That's really important.
Yeah. Right. And they found that the health of those trees after construction was directly related to their proximity to those paved areas and the level of soil compaction.
Which makes sense when you think about it. Even if we can't see the damage happening underground, construction can really disrupt a tree's root systems and its access to water and oxygen.
Absolutely. And then Talking Trees also highlighted a publication from this year, 2023, called Trees and Construction, the Design Phase. This one really emphasized the importance of early arborist involvement, getting us in on those plans, before the bulldozers show up. That can make a huge difference.
It's like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly.
And speaking of prevention, they also talked about those tree protection zones, right? The TPZs you often see marked around trees at construction sites.
Yeah, they explain how the size and shape of those zones are actually tailored to each individual tree based on its species, size, and overall health. And they even touched on a European arboricultural standard for tree protection during construction and events, also from this year.
Oh, wow. So they really covered a lot of ground.
They did. It was interesting to see how they approach things like impact assessment, planning those protection measures, and even follow-up care, making sure the trees are doing okay after the construction is finished.
So for our listeners, what would you say is the key takeaway from all of this? What should they be thinking about when it comes to construction and tree preservation?
I think the big takeaway is that safeguarding trees on a construction site, it's not just a one-time thing. It's a process. It requires a combination of those well-defined ordinances, early involvement of arborists, and a deep understanding of each tree's unique needs and vulnerabilities. It's really about being proactive and advocating for the trees, even when it's not convenient or easy. It really is. And, that leads us right into Thursday's episode, which talked about something that I'm sure our listeners are familiar with, the 10-20-30 rule for urban forestry.
Oh, yeah, we did touch on that briefly when we were talking about diversity, but Thursday's episode really dove deep into the benefits and, the limitations of this rule.
Yeah, it's a great guideline suggesting that no more than 10% of trees in an urban forest should be of one species, 20% from one genus, and then 30% from a single family,
Right, it's all about spreading the risk, so to speak.
Exactly. It helps minimize that risk of, losing a big chunk of the urban canopy to a single pest or disease outbreak.
Yeah, it's don't put all your eggs in one basket, but for trees.
Exactly. And they explored, just how effective this rule really is.
And it's not just about resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's also about, creating a more visually appealing and ecologically rich landscape.
Oh, absolutely. When you have a variety of tree species, you get this amazing tapestry of, shapes and sizes and colors throughout the seasons, and it adds so much character to a neighborhood.
Yeah. And on the ecological side, different tree species support different kinds of wildlife.
Yeah.
So you're creating a much more vibrant and balanced ecosystem.
Right. You're not just planting trees for people. You're creating habitats for birds and insects and all those creatures that make up a healthy urban ecosystem.
Right. It's all connected. But they were also careful to point out that the 10-20-30 rule isn't, one size fits all. It's a great starting point, but you might need to adjust it depending on the local climate and the scale of the urban forest.
Yeah, it's not a rigid formula, more of a guiding principle that you adapt to the specific conditions, of each city or town.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, you're working in all these different environments. What's the takeaway here?
I think the main thing is that understanding this rule and recognizing when it might need some tweaking is really crucial for ensuring the long-term health and resilience of the urban forest that you're caring for.
Absolutely. It's about being adaptable and responsive to the unique challenges of each site. All right, so let's move on to Friday's episode of Talking Trees, which got into a very practical topic, Mistletoe management.
Oh, yeah, mistletoe. I'm sure most of our listeners have had to deal with this, persistent parasite at some point.
Oh, I'm sure they have. It's one of those challenges that just comes with the territory, right?
It does. And Talking Trees actually featured this methodological guide for managing mistletoe in non-forest environments.
Okay, so not just in, natural woodlands, but in parks and streetscapes and those kinds of areas.
Right, exactly. And what I thought was really valuable was that it emphasized the importance of like a thorough assessment. Before you do anything, you really need to understand the extent of the infestation and the overall health of the tree.
So it's not just about, hacking away at the mistletoe, but taking a more strategic and informed approach.
Exactly. And they outline, those three primary methods for mistletoe reduction: pruning, chemical treatment using Epiphan, and then sometimes, complete tree removal if it's necessary.
So kind of a range of options depending on the situation.
Right. And the guide explains, when each approach is most appropriate based on the tree's condition and, how bad the infestation is. So, for example, if you have a minor infestation on a healthy, vigorous tree, pruning might be enough. But if the tree's already stressed and it's heavily infested, removal might be the best option to prevent further decline.
Makes sense. So they really covered all the bases, it sounds like. What else stood out to you from this guide?
Well, they really stressed the importance of safety measures, permits and licensing requirements if you're using chemicals. And meticulous record-keeping mistletoe management isn't just about, dealing with the parasite. It's about doing it responsibly and professionally.
Right, and making sure that you're protecting yourself and the surrounding environment.
Exactly. Okay, so let's wrap up the week with Saturday's episode, which focused on a specific genus of trees, Aesculus, or horse chestnuts.
Ah, horse chestnuts, beautiful trees, but they do seem to have their fair share of problems.
They do, and this episode really honed in on those, pesky diseases that often affect their leaves. They actually featured two separate research papers. The first one looked at these tiny parasitic wasps that attack the horse chestnut leaf miner, Cameraria oridella.
So it's like a natural enemy of this pest.
Yeah.
A biological control agent.
Exactly. And what's cool is that this study was done in southwest London, and they actually analyzed the parasitism rates of these wasps and compared it to similar studies in Europe. They were looking at how well these tiny warriors are doing at controlling the leaf miner population.
So kind of assessing the effectiveness of this natural predator.
Exactly. Now, the second research paper focused on leaf blotch disease caused by a fungus, Gignardia aesculi, and they really dove deep into how this fungus grows, looking at the effects of different growth mediums, pH levels, and even UV exposure on its growth and spore production.
Wow. So they were really getting into the nitty-gritty of this fungus.
They were. And by understanding these factors that influence the fungus, we can start to develop more effective strategies for preventing and managing leaf blotch disease in horse chestnuts.
It's all about getting to the root of the problem, so to speak.
Exactly. So there you have it, folks. A whole week of talking trees condensed into, a quick overview.
We've journeyed from a tree's entire lifespan to the, microscopic world of fungi and leaf miners and everything in between.
Yeah, and it really makes you realize how connected all these aspects of tree care are. We've talked about pruning techniques, construction protection, disease management, and diversity. They all tie back to understanding, how trees function as living systems within that larger ecosystem. It's not just about individual trees. It's about the whole, urban forest and its role in the health of our communities.
It really is. It all comes full circle. And that brings me to a question for our listeners. Given everything we've discussed today, from the latest research to those practical management strategies, what one change would you make in your approach to caring for the urban forest in your community? What really resonated with you?
That is a fantastic question to leave everyone with, because even though we covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, it's really just the beginning of the conversation, right?
It is. We want to hear from you, your thoughts, your experiences, those aha moments you had while listening. So head over to the comments section and share those insights. Let's keep this conversation going and, learn from each other.
Because at the end of the day, we're all on the same team, working to ensure healthy and thriving urban forests for generations to come.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time, happy tree climbing, everyone.
Thank you for joining us for this recap episode of Talking Trees. We hope you enjoyed revisiting these crucial topics on tree care and management. From understanding the lifelong care of trees to the nuances of arborist climbing, and from protecting trees during construction to managing mistletoe and addressing tree diseases, we've covered a wide range of vital insights. If you'd like to stay updated with more in-depth discussions and expert perspectives, make sure to follow us on herohero.co/talkingtrees and check out our extended content. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and take care of the trees around you. See you on the next episode of Talking Trees.